I'm going to talk about ethnographic philosophy, and I'm going to talk about how I think it naturalizes philosophy and how I think it helps us articulate concepts. So a couple of sort of precursors. I'm not the only one working on this. There are lots of other people working on it, among them Sabina, who's here. I don't know where. Yeah, so that's just to recognize that I'm not the only one working on it. I'm going to do a lot of simplifications, so the risk is that I'm going to just offend everyone that I refer to. I hope you'll give me some sort of trust and come criticize me if you think I did it wrongly. Before I start, I want to just read a quote to you that I think sort of captures the spirit of my paper, but I actually also think it captures the spirit of lots of what's been going on at this conference. So I'm just going to read the quote out to you, and it's a quote from the tour. Sighs the traditional subject. If only I could extract myself from this narrow-minded body and roam through the cosmos unfettered by any instrument, I would see the world as it is, without words, without models, without controversies, silent and contemplative. Really, replies the articulated body, with some benign surprise. Why do you wish to be dead? For myself, I want to be alive, and thus I want more words, more controversies, more artificial settings, more instruments, so as to become more sensitive to even more differences. My kingdom for a more embodied body. So this talk is about how to make philosophy of science more alive to the world, suggesting that at least one strategy for this is ethnographic philosophy. I want to situate this suggestion as a future that follows on from two present movements, philosophy of science in practice and feminist philosophy of science, and also new decolonization scholarships. So around the turn of the 21st century, philosophy of science saw what's now called the practice turn, with an increasing focus on drawing philosophical insights from science in the making. And I think it's been really interesting to hear how that was actually already a big topic of debate early on in logical empiricism. So a central claim of the practice turn is to turn away from excessively idealized reconstructions of what scientists do or should have done in order to develop a philosophy of science which is descriptively adequate and which builds from a contextualized, material, tacit, collective, and psychosocial characterization of science. And these are quotes from an edited volume by Lena Soler and some of her colleagues, but you find similar kinds of statements in a paper by Baumans and Leonelli, 2013, and also in a paper by Kenny, Chang, Baumans, and Boone from 2011, which I think was actually based on an early version of SPSP held here in Minnesota in 2009. So in parallel to this, feminist philosophers of science also turned philosophy of science in new directions, and we've heard lots about that, and this is definitely not my specialty area, so I apologize to all the experts in the room. So at the end of slightly earlier than the practice turn, at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, feminist philosophers of science turned their gaze critically towards our views on knowledge and asked about the context and social regulations of this term. So in particular, they resisted the idea that the traditional philosophical concept of knowledge was just an innocent term, and they objected to the idea that the knower is a disembodied intellect. So they want us to take seriously that knowers are situated, interdependent, and entwined with the world. And I think this has been said many times over the past few days. So in turn of this, we realized that productions and valuations of knowledge might look different in different locations and within different communities. And of course, this is one of the key points made in current decolonization scholarship. And I just want to highlight a few here. So Chimakonam, for example, argues that in order to understand African philosophy, traditional philosophers of science need to rid themselves of what he calls their myths, including the myth of the absolute epistemic category. Babalola Balogun argues that when concepts from non-European contexts, such as the Akan African community, are analyzed within a traditional Western analytic framework without any awareness of the sort of positionality that this type of analysis comes with, they're at risk of being severely misunderstood. And Ganeri has made similar arguments for concepts from Sanskrit. So I want to argue that ethnographic philosophy has the potential to address important lessons from both of these movements and to change the way that we do philosophy of science. This is because ethnography situates philosophical work in a double sense. So first, like other qualitative and historical styles of research, ethnography is contextual and case-specific. It explores practices as situated in their everyday historical social context. But second, and this is the point that I really want to drive home, ethnography in particular situates the researcher, relying on researcher positionality rather than trying to erase it. Okay, so as I said, there's already people working on ethnographic philosophy in philosophy of science, lots of people doing very good work. But this work has tended to focus very much on the sort of practice turn sentiment, focusing on the way that ethnography can naturalize philosophy through the first type of situatedness. So ethnography provides a means for making philosophical concepts responsive to empirical matters. So ethnographic philosophy, like many other empirical movements in philosophy of science, follows Quine's original call to, and I quote, discover how science is in fact developed and learnt rather than to fabricate a fictitious structure, end of quote. So sometimes this is taken to mean that philosophy should use only methods from natural sciences, but I take it here in a much broader sense to imply something like empirical methods used in philosophy. And I think Carol's response to Sabina's comment yesterday was along those same lines. Now, a way that ethnography differs from other kinds of empirical research, still within this sort of first type of contextualization, is that it also naturalizes in a second sense, namely in the sense that it does naturalistic inquiry. This is a term that Lincoln and Gubbe coins, but Nesession and MacLeod has sort of emphasized this as a requirement for in situ data collection, seeing phenomena in their natural setting. So here the important contrast is not so much the speculative, but the artificial. Okay, there's a lot to be said about this. I'm short on time here, so I'm happy to talk a lot more about these things. What I really want to say here is again, that the point I want to drive home is that the second point has been, the second type of situation has been untreated so far. But let me say a little bit more about what ethnography is. So I talk about ethnography as a style of research, and this is because ethnography uses lots of different methods and different methodologies, has lots of different disciplinary affiliations, but there is still some aspects of it that make it coherent as a style different from other empirical styles of research. This is a very busy slide. I won't go into a lot of it. I talked more in depth about a similar kind of slide at Minnesota International Postdoc Forum a year ago. You can find the video online if you want to hear more. I discuss it there also with an anthropologist. So I've already highlighted one feature, which is the in situ feature. But for this talk, there's another feature which is really important, which is namely the being with and the immersive part of ethnography. So typically when you do ethnography, and you might think of people doing fieldwork, the sentiment is that you go and share the space with the kind of community that you're interested in exploring. And this goes even if you're sort of just doing selective ethnography of, say, medical consensus conferences, and you're just participating in those meetings, the way that you participate is meant to be a sort of immersive participation. Now, the key point here is that there's really no way of participating in communities without being your own concrete self and body. Okay. So along with these two aspects, also the ideographic aspects, so the sort of looking at particular case studies in depth, these three aspects create some worry in some philosophers. It makes ethnography troublesome in the light of some of the traditional philosophical aspirations, namely universal truth and pure rational intellect. So I'm going to give you two arguments. Again, the first one is one that's been given more or less already, but I think this is a clear way of phrasing it. It goes towards this worry of whether ethnography is useful for philosophy or not. So in recent work, Hannon and Young has convincingly, I think, argued that if we take true universal answers to be the aim of philosophy, we're really doing quite a poor job. there's very few philosophical questions that we've managed to finally answer. Instead, they say, if we see philosophy as a practice of creating understanding, many of the philosophical questions we actually sort of now have a much better grasp of their complexities, their interlinking, the various different options that we have for answering them, and the sort of costs and limitations of these different possibilities. Heather Chang has made a similar argument in favor of using historical case studies for philosophy. So he suggests that rather than suggesting that the value of philosophy here is not to provide us with generalizable truths about scientific practice, but rather in helping us articulate abstract concepts that help us understand specific historical episodes, so sort of as a tools for adding to our conceptual repertoire, we might say. Okay, so qualitative and historical methods generally might contribute to philosophy of science by aiding concept articulation. And here I think both in terms of helping us come up with new concepts for cases that we don't have adequate concepts for, but also by nuancing and contextualizing concepts that we already have. So this is something that Latour discusses in terms of making more articulate. Okay. Now, ethnography in particular might be helpful if we want to articulate concepts about certain topics. So, for example, social processes, embodied or tacit aspects of knowledge creation. The reason ethnography might be particularly apt for these kinds of topics is because of the immersive aspect. Now, the immersive aspect also has a downside, namely reactivity. So while ethnography sort of finds the phenomenon in nature, let's say it's naturalistic, goes to the natural environment of the phenomenon, it does actually introduce an instrument, which is the researcher, in this environment. And doing so might affect the environment quite strongly. So when you do participant observation, this is very clearly the case. You just realize the first day that you show up that people do respond to you being there. So they might respond to your gender, your age, the way you speak, the prior knowledge that you signal that you have, the kind of social or cultural skills you have. And these are all decisive features in deciding what you get access to, what kinds of things are left silent, and what kinds of people want to speak to you. So there are ways of manipulating this, but importantly, there's no way to avoid it. So for example, when I was doing fieldwork in a hospital, people would tell me very different things, whether I was wearing scrubs, which is the surgeon uniform, or nursing dress. If I wasn't wearing any of those, people would just assume that I was a nurse because of my gender. Okay, so in ethnography and traditional practice of ethnography, there are ways of addressing this, which I will come to, but I just want to stress that it might be the case that this is particularly clearly a problem in ethnography, but I think the point of feminist philosophy of science is that we're naive to think that this is merely a problem in philosophy. Merely a problem in ethnography. So the point of feminist scholarship is that positionality is ubiquitous, and while we may be able to ignore it, While we may be able to ignore the contingencies involved in being bodies rather than brains and vats, when we practice armchair philosophy, this doesn't mean that the contingencies aren't there. So I think that the fact that we cannot ignore positionality in ethnography is actually its strength, and it's what brings me to my second and last point. So within traditional ethnography, the method for addressing this problem of reactivity is reflexivity. So this is a very important requirement, and it's the basic idea that you reflect upon your own position, your own features, and the ways that might have affected the field, also based on the sort of interactive responses that you get. So it's tempting to think that these strategies aim at a sort of methodological bracketing or neutralizing of the reactive aspect. But much like with the true answers aspiration of philosophy, most ethnographers don't think that it's a viable aspiration for ethnography to sort of get rid of reactivity, nor necessarily that this is something that we would want. So instead, they encourage us to use reactivity consciously and actively, and to be reactive in as many ways as possible. And I think this really nicely echoes some of the feminist philosophy encouragements for plurality over neutrality. Okay. So I want to argue that beyond methodological and phenomenon naturalization, ethnography also contributes naturalization of the subject in philosophy. So it ties the inquiring subject into the natural world and requires us to think about our position. It places constraints on philosophers in regard to our position. So it makes philosophy responsive to and responsible for our own empirical matters. And I think this is something along the lines of what Hugh Price talks about when he talks about subject naturalization or naturalism. Okay, so to sum up, I want to propose that ethnographic philosophy, if taken seriously as a method for a future philosophy of science, can bring the two trends together, of philosophy of science and practice and feminist philosophy of science together for a more responsible philosophical practice and a healthier grasp on the epistemic challenges that philosophy has. And just to end, I want to say that there is now a category on Phil papers called ethnographic philosophy. So anyone who's doing ethnographic philosophy, writing about ethnographic philosophy, please tag your papers so that we can share our knowledge. That would be great. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Helene. This was great. I was wondering, so I completely agree with you that reflexivity is a really important ingredient for philosophers and something that ethnography just makes necessary. I wanted to push a little bit on making more explicit what gains actually there are from that practice. I can think of a number. I mean, certainly for me, one of the things that's been very important is seeing the way, being forced to see the ways in which your normative commitments as a philosopher may actually signify and articulate themselves in very different ways when it comes to scientific practice. For instance, the idea of reductionism. I'm a very strong anti-reductionist, but what this has meant over the years in interacting and being part of ethnographic collaborations with a variety of different parts of biology is really nuanced my understanding of what it means to be a reductionist, for instance, or not. So I wondered whether you can share some of your thoughts about this or other aspects that you've learned from this kind of reflexivity.
Right. Okay. So I think there's a lot to say about reflexivity. It's a massive thing. There's now I can't remember all. There's like several different kinds of reflexivity, and some of them are going to be about. Sorry. Some of them are going to be about the kinds of convictions that you hold. Some of them are going to be about the kinds of effects that you have on the field. And these are different layers. And this, I think, there's a scholar called Madden who has like 4 different. One of them is the political position you have. I can't remember at this moment. So that's sort of one thing, is that reflexivity covers lots of different things, and each of these things will teach you lessons. So there's a lesson about what kinds of presuppositions you hold that you will learn when you go into the field and realize that things surprise you, that suddenly scientists make inferences that don't sort of concur with your reductionism, or you get surprised and you have to figure out what presuppositions you had that caused this surprise. There are also other kinds of surprises, like this is not surprising, but people taking me to be a nurse signals something about what the roles of gender are in the field, what kinds of dynamics are going on that are based on these kind of stereotypes in the field, that teaches you something about the field, not necessarily about your own presuppositions. Generally, I think what's very important in reflexivity and what, so I think sort of abductive ethnography, sorry, now the name escapes me, but the strain of ethnography that talks about abductive inferences and really emphasizes the role of surprise in the field, that gives you this sort of offset for thinking about both your own role and the different presuppositions that are in the field and in you, is a really good framework for thinking about reflexivity.
Thank you for your talk. So this is super interesting, but I wonder if you could maybe say something about the trade-offs associated with potential losing critical distance with regard to the scientific practices you're studying, because there's always a danger that philosophers doing this kind of immersive research or collaborating very closely with scientists might end up adopting the dominant perspectives in particular fields, even if those perspectives are problematic from an epistemic or a political standpoint.
Right, so this is something that Miles McLeod has thought a lot about, I think. So he emphasizes this as, there's a lot of strength in philosophers using different methods and then coming together and then, I say armchair, I know that's a bit of a sort of derogatory term, but armchair philosophers reminding me that I should be more critical. So we meet in conferences, we use different methods, and remind each other of the important things, right, from different perspectives. But so Miles has argued that actually ethnography tries to walk that balance between critical distance and actual engagement, whereas you have traditions like philosophy in science, where you have to publish with scientists and you have to sort of collaborate, and that ties you in very strictly in some power dynamics that you're not tied into necessarily as an ethnographer. So typically when you do ethnography, you try, to some extent at least, to keep at a distance from the kind of internal power structures. Of course, you're in the wealth of it when you're doing your field work, but you shouldn't be sort of dependent on co-publications and so on with your field subjects, because that compromises your critical distance.
There's a couple of more questions in the queue, but I'm afraid we are out of time.
Please find me.